Good morning, everyone. Again, we might start to get settled. It's really good actually to hear all the conversation that's happening. So we've got an engaged audience and people are getting into the day. I'll just give it another minute for people to come in and continue to talk for a moment. So, all right, I think we're kind of getting there. Excellent. All right. Welcome to session 2, everyone. And just before we go on, there's a couple of questions for the use of the Q&A. It's in the events app that I think there's some details that would have been emailed to you, but you go to program and then there's a live Q&A poll which you can enter in questions and go from there. I was a little bit technically challenged and I couldn't even find the app on my phone, but I knew I opened it the other day, so I'll have a look again when I'm sitting down. But it's in there. One of our staff, Jono, he showed me that it works. So, but just a reminder that that's how you get into the Q&A. So this session, session 2, we're going to go from the broad, talking about the international context, the domestic economy, and where we're going at the aggregate level for agriculture, to really focus in on the sector and some of the detail. And you would have heard me say this before, but agriculture is a very diverse sector. So we operate across a diverse set of environments. Agriculture operates on over 55% of Australia's landmass, and as a continent that encompasses a whole range of different environments, different landscapes and the like. We account for close to 14% of the goods and services that we export as a country. We contribute close to 3% to our GDP, and we employ over 2% of Australian workers. Not only that, we also use about 3/4 of Australia's water. So that's quite a footprint. And that brings me to our first speaker in this session. And so I would like to welcome Adam Fennessy, who's the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. And now the department plays a big role in helping the sector overall deliver, from providing access to international markets, to ensuring our biosecurity, to providing a whole range of regulatory services and helping to steward the sector through a whole range of different policy changes. Now, Adam has over 25 years of sector experience at both state and federal levels. His former roles have included Secretary of the Victorian Department of Environment and Primary Industries, Secretary of the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, so he went again, the Victorian Public Sector Commissioner and Dean and CEO of ANZOG, which is the Australian and New Zealand School of Government. Adam has also worked outside the government sector and has been a partner in a global advisory firm, Ernst & Young. Now, Adam's going to talk to us today about his priorities for the department and to ensure that it continues to safeguard and grow a sustainable agriculture, fisheries and forestry for all Australians. As you'll hear, key to this will be industry and community engagement and strengthening our ability to deliver agile, high quality and forward-looking policy advice. And so with that, you welcome Adam to the stage. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jared. Good morning to everybody. Thank you for that warm welcome. I'm delighted to be here today. There's such a positive buzz in the room. As you heard from Jared's introduction, I've been an Agriculture Secretary equivalent in Victoria, and every year when I was in that role, we'd always be making a beeline for the ABARES Outlook conference. So now I get to be here in my role as Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. So it's so exciting generally to get to be involved in an Outlook conference, and now I get to be here in an official capacity. So I'm very appreciative of that opportunity. It is my first ABARES Outlook conference as the Secretary of Agriculture, Fisheries, Forestry. Before I go any further, I want to start by acknowledging we're on Ngunnawal country. And I want to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land that we're on, as well as other people and families with connection to the lands of the ACT and regions. And because we are going hybrid, I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from wherever people are dialing in from around Australia. I don't know where our hybrid cameras are, Jared, but I'll just sort of wave that way, or maybe up the back. And it is really exciting to not only have a full room with your commitment, experience, passion, energy and insight, but also to have people joining us online, which means we can have more discussion, more engagement, more participation. I'd also like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today in the room or online. So my first 6 months, because I've clocked over, I've stopped counting days and weeks, and now I'm over 6 months in the role, have been very exciting, very challenging, very energising. I love being more formally and squarely back in the agriculture sector. I do love the fact that there are some very familiar faces who have moved around in the sector or are still in leadership roles, and there's a lot of new perspectives, new people involved, new organisations. That's what a vibrant sector does. That's why agriculture in Australia is such an exciting place to be. I love that continuity. I also have really enjoyed when I was an agriculture secretary at a state government level, that step into a national and an international context, having been very involved in all of those officials' meetings in critical things like biosecurity, as well as policy and interjurisdictional work. It's very exciting to see how we can contribute to the billions of dollars of international trade, all the way through to the local community engagement, local community economic opportunity, as well as at the national level. I do learn something every day in this role, which is something I also love. There's never a dull moment in agriculture. Yesterday morning, we started the day with the latest intake of Nuffield scholars, and I know some of them will be here today. That just shows the incredible vibrancy and diversity of leadership across the sector, including the next generation of agricultural leaders. What I'll do today is reflect on my approach as the DAF Secretary. It's a very broad sector, and our department has a very important role, but it's only one role in private sector, public sector, not-for-profit community that makes agriculture, fisheries and forestry succeed across Australia. My first priority is actually an internal priority for the organisation. So last year, before I started in my role, the Australian Public Service Commission did an independent review of the department, DAF, including how we could improve our governance, improve our financial management, be a better place to work. Why is that my number one priority, and why is it important? A strengthened department can better meet the needs of Australian agriculture, as well as the Australian government priorities, and more importantly, your needs and expectations. Many of us work in large organisations, some of us run our own businesses, and change really starts where you're at, change starts at home. So our ability as a department to become more proactive, more outward-facing, stronger focus on service delivery. Jared's mentioned stronger capabilities around community engagement and also running a disciplined approach to our budgets. That's really important. And while that's an internally focused priority, that then allows us to better prepare Australian agriculture for the future. So that's been my starting priority. In terms of the broader priorities for me and the department, I'm going to talk about 4 today. There's a very long list. Generally, I like to have a top 3, but I'm going for a top 4, and we've certainly worked this through with many of you in the room and the sector, as well as across our organisation. So I'll talk briefly today about climate sustainable agriculture, and in particular the Ag and Land Sector Plan. I'll talk about the Future Drought Fund, I'll talk about biosecurity, and I'll talk about accessing new and existing international markets. So in terms of the Ag and Land Sector Plan, and Jared will have already reflected on some of these opportunities and challenges, we do face a range of challenges as well as opportunities, and many of you and many of your businesses, represented by those of whom in the room, are doing it tough. We've got squeezes on margins from global inflation, we've got trade disruptions, we've got a strong focus on shareholder primacy with big organisations like our supermarkets. All of that has required government to be very responsive. It puts a lot of pressure on you all, and it also creates opportunities for the sector that we've got to keep our eye on. So one example at the moment, which is not related specifically to the Ag and Land Sector Plan, but is that cost of living focus across Australia. We've been very involved as an organisation working with the ACCC and the Australian Treasury on processes like the review into the Food and Grocery Code of Conduct. That is being led by Dr. Craig Emerson, our Minister, who you will welcome this morning Minister Murray Watt has co-chaired some roundtables with producers and processors so that within the context of cost of living, we can focus on what does that mean for primary production and what does that mean for processors, what does it mean in terms of the supply chain, how do we keep our eye on impacts on the sector, as well as the overall cost of living pressures across Australia. That is a critical focus for us. It's an example of the pressure that we're under across the sector, thinking more broadly about opportunities and then moving to climate change and climate sustainable ag. What we also know is that we've got growing populations in Australia and globally. We've got, in some of our market sectors, rising incomes. We also have a changing climate. So the challenges are coming in all sorts of directions. We're bringing our focus back on what does foreign demand look like for our produce, how do we increase that, and how do we keep our focus on productivity and sustainability. And that's where the "and" is really important in that phrase. We know that by 2050 there'll be around 3 billion more high-income consumers globally who will be seeking high-quality food and fibre, and we want that to be our high-quality food and fibre. In Asia, the value of agri-food consumption is projected to rise by over 45% to 2050. And the ASEAN Summit in Melbourne today, from which Minister Watt dialed in to address you all, is an immediate reminder of the growth in markets of our immediate regional neighbours, many of which we are already accessing, but with those growing populations and growing economies, there's also that demand for high quality food and fibre from Australia. At the same time, we have around 140 economies globally charting their own paths to meet net zero obligations that have been agreed to through international fora and searching for like-minded trading partners. So the Australian government's agricultural land and sectoral plan gives us an opportunity to set the sector up to shape change rather than to just respond to it. And I know, Jared, you've got a thoughtful opinion piece in the Australian Financial Review today that talks about how do we get ahead and shape change rather than be shaped by it. So we have been in detailed consultation with many of you in this room on the Australian Government Ag and Land Sector Plan, led by Jared and team and others in our policy area. And we're working through more than 230 public submissions to develop next steps. It's more than just reducing emissions. The goal is to raise Australia's standing as a global supplier of sustainable food and fibre. So we're very much thinking about global supply chains. The focus of the Ag and Land Sector Plan is to grow export markets, improve productivity and keep downward pressure on input costs. And in particular, how do we think about enhancing your profitability, not just your productivity? The changes need to cut emissions while building productivity, sustainability and resilience. They do present a very challenging set of issues. These are faced by all sectors. I am proud of the fact that in the Australian government context, we were the first sector under the net zero approach to get out there for public consultation on our plan. And it's not about just getting out there before other sectors, it is about proactivity. So energy, transport, housing are all looking at this from a sectoral plan. It's great that we're out there having those conversations with you, looking at best practice nationally, best practice internationally, and what does it also mean for local, all the way through to farmer productivity and profitability. We're also very mindful that our international markets and competitors and friends will also be driving standards, particularly out of the US and the EU. So how do we keep an eye on those global markets and conditions and practices that will continue to allow us to shape productivity and profitability for the Australian agricultural sector? The second thing I'll talk about is the Future Drought Fund. As part of our response to climate change, the resilience of the agriculture sector is a critical priority for us, and it's a big priority for us in 2024. We're very focused on supporting local and business level innovation and practice across Australia, learning from you and supporting you, particularly those working directly in agribusiness, to find out what works for your business. We know there's not one size fits all. Sustainable agriculture, what works for a broadacre cropping enterprise in Merredin, WA is going to look different. There in the WA sheep belt is going to be very different for a cattle station in the McDonnell Ranges in the Territory or for dairy in Gippsland in Victoria. How do we learn from, share best practice both nationally, but also work out what's going on globally, always bringing the focus back to local response as well. One of our best national assets to prepare for changing weather patterns is the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. It has already allowed thousands of farmers to gear up your agribusinesses with the latest technology to support and invest in your livelihoods. So some really good examples that I have seen. The department's work with the Kiewa Catchment Landcare Group near Lake Hume in Victoria to put on the Kiewa Carbon Bash. That involved trials of ways to raise carbon in soil to improve production and soil health. Local farmers took home new technology and ideas from workshops attached to those trials and put them into practice in their own businesses. Meanwhile, in central Queensland, we worked with the Central Highlands Regional Resource Use Planning Cooperative to restore pasture and reduce erosion. And some very practical modifications included erosion control banks, water tanks, troughs, rotational grazing, leading to farmers getting more out of their country while also restoring its ecology. So to me, that's a good example of protection of environment and production, always having the and, so we get outcomes that are both good for production and profitability and good for landscapes and natural asset management. So they're two good examples of successful cooperation that bring together productivity and sustainability. And to help that work continue, a new drought resilience funding plan has recently been launched that will guide investment of the next $400 million that will be available from the Future Drought Fund up until 2028. So that's the example of the second priority we're focusing on this year. I mentioned the Nuffield Scholars. I think I can see a few of those green ties. We've sponsored 5 scholarships out of the Future Drought Fund this year. So that's another opportunity for us to tap right into innovation where we find it, where we see it. And a shout out to those who have joined us today from the Nuffield Scholarship Program. The third area is accessing new and growing existing markets. So as a nation, our ability to respond effectively to national challenges will have a very significant bearing on future agricultural production and trade. You will have heard already that 2024 promises to be another strong year for agricultural exports, with improved market access and tariff cuts creating new opportunities. We've got a strong baseline. Nevertheless, free trade agreements have got to be a constant area of focus for us as a department, particularly thinking about different sectors: red meat, grain, horticulture, other agricultural industries. A couple of good examples from very recent times is the UK FTA and the work we're doing with India. So sheep meat exports in the UK, or to the UK, were $31 million in the third quarter of 2023, up 35% on the corresponding quarter from the previous year before that FTA was not in place. And beef exports over that same period increased nearly fourfold. So it shows that these FTAs do make a difference, and it's a critical role that the Australian government and that the department has. It's a similar sort of story in India, with the Australia-India Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement already seeing dramatic early rises in the value of exports since it's been in place. So that's that third area of priority for this calendar year. And then the fourth and final that I'll mention, and this was also mentioned by the Minister this morning, was our focus on sustainable biosecurity funding. That approach over the last year or the last 18 months has delivered more than $1 billion in funding over 4 years, and $267 million per year ongoing to invest in and to strengthen our biosecurity systems across Australia. For the first time ever, Australia's biosecurity system has got locked in and ongoing funding. Our biosecurity system is a critical national asset for our agriculture, fisheries and forestry sectors, and that makes sure that we've got the right investment in our biosecurity to withstand increasing biosecurity threats. That package also delivered structural reform to biosecurity funding, so that costs are now shared between key players across the system: taxpayers, those who create risk, including importers, as well as travellers and primary producers. The Minister has certainly been very public and may have mentioned this morning as well that with legislation now going through the Parliament and implementation proposed from 1 July this year, the government is introducing a modest biosecurity protection levy on primary producers, along with a low-value import biosecurity clearance charge and cost-reflective arrangements with Australia Post. So when all these changes take place and are implemented, taxpayers will contribute to about 44% of total biosecurity funding, importers 48%, agricultural producers 6%, and Australia Post 2%. Now, any additional impost on industry is a real challenge to your business and your profitability. So as a department, we've got to be very mindful of those impacts. That's why the efficient running of the department is actually my first priority. And secondly, setting up new forums to make more transparent and to get more direct feedback from many industry groups who are in the room today on the process for this fund collection and reinvestment. So it does provide, in my view, critical insurance and assurance to protect our unique Australian markets and our unique Australian environments and our $84 billion agriculture, fisheries and forestry sectors. So they are the 4 priorities that we are focusing on this year. We have a much longer list than that, but in particular, climate smart agriculture, our future drought fund program, sustainable biosecurity funding and increasing new access to export markets. This will allow us to grow our $84 billion sector, and we've got an aspiration of beyond $100 billion, position us for new markets and tap into that innovation at the local and the national level. So I think in conclusion, my colleagues and I, including at ABARES, are very much focused on raising resilience, productivity, sustainability and profitability across the sector. I look forward to many more meaningful conversations with you. I've also welcomed the opportunity to engage directly with many of you in the room today and many of your organisations to shape a better future for Australian agriculture. So thank you very much for the opportunity to address you all. Enjoy the rest of ABARES Outlook 2024. And Jared, I'm going to hand back to you.
Adam's offered just to maybe stick around for a question or two, so I'll see if there's anything coming up. Otherwise, I might ping in with one. You don't always get a chance to quiz your boss, so it's always a good opportunity. Can't see them coming up, so I'm going to jump in. So one of the things you mentioned, Adam, was really about being more prominent in terms of government decision making with a stronger service delivery focus. Could you elaborate just a little bit on that? Because I think it's quite important for the audience.
Yeah, so there's 2 things I'll say about that. One is many of you, well, you're all in Canberra today, many of you work here, some of you come here to talk to us. To me, within the Australian Public Service, my view is the Agriculture Department has to have very sharp elbows. We've got to be very proactive. We've got to work very closely with other departments like climate change, environment, energy and water, where policy settings there can have a big impact, create risks for us, and if we work it proactively can create opportunities. We're doing a lot of work with the Industry Department and thinking about access to other government funding like the National Reconstruction Fund. Going back to the Environment Department, the National Heritage Trust. We work very closely with our colleagues from a whole of government perspective. I've mentioned Treasury as well already and the Prime Minister's Department. So one thing I'm very focused is that we're very proactive across Canberra and all the different parts of the Australian government. And then secondly, I've put a lot of focus in my first 6 months on getting out and about, talking to industry, talking to communities, seeing things on the ground. So to me, that's the proactivity that has been in the department before. How do we make that more systematic so that we are here working as hard as possible across government systems, with industry, with community.
Excellent. Thanks, Adam. And we might take that opportunity just to thank you again, and then we'll move on to the next part of our session. So thanks again to Adam for taking the time out to talk to us.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks, everyone. And a particular shout out to the ABARES team who have done a magnificent job, as well as the ABARES Executive Director, Dr. Jared Greenville.
Oh, thank you. I don't know. Thanks, Adam. So now we'll move on to a bit more of a deeper focus onto some of our commodities and the outlook across our different commodities. And I'll just welcome up a number of my team who are going to join us on stage. And just also a shout out, tomorrow we'll go into a deeper session as well around fisheries. So there's more to be had. This year, as we kind of mentioned, we're doing a few things differently, picking up on past feedback. And so what we'll do is we'll start off by having a bit of a conversation around the different broad industries across, and I'm going to give my analysts about 5 minutes each to give us a bit of a broad overview, and then we'll go to some direct questions, and so feel free to kind of pull them in as we go along, and you don't need to wait. And so the advantage of having a group of people who really know is that you don't just need to listen, you don't have to listen to me, you can get into the detail with our experts. So I've got members from across the team, which I'll introduce as we go along. But I'm going to start with Alistair Reid, and Alistair heads our livestock team here and gets into the detail of all our livestock sectors. But one of the things, and a question that was in a way posed to me this morning, is that we've noticed that a lot's been going on in livestock markets recently, particularly with prices, and we saw that at the end of last year, and then they've changed again this year. How does that flow through to 2024, and what are you thinking is going to be the main forces that are going to drive sector outcomes in next financial year?
Yeah, so it was a pretty eventful year in 2023-24. Obviously, the main story we saw was livestock prices falling quite significantly for cattle, sheep and lambs. Really, we saw that being driven by sort of four main factors. We saw quite a large increase in the supply of animals going to sale yards. We also saw with the dry conditions, a lot of restocker demand was coming out of the sale yards, which also weighed on prices. And our third factor we saw was processing capacity had a little bit of a lag time getting up and running, so we had some constrained processing demand from the processors in the sale yards. And then finally, we saw, particularly for sheep meat, but as well as beef, we saw falling world prices really contribute to that downwards pressure on sale yard prices. So in 24-25, we're expecting. It's probably useful first to outline our seasonal conditions assumptions. So we're assuming, as Jared mentioned before, neutral seasonal conditions in 2024-25, which is basically average climate conditions, so non-El Nino or El Nino occurring. So keeping that in mind, we're assuming that the value of livestock production, forecasting value of livestock production is going to increase in 24-25, up by about 12%, as I think you see on the screen, to just over $36 billion. And so that's driven a lot by the increase in sale yard prices for cattle, sheep and lambs, but also by a small increase in production. In terms of exports, we're expecting exports to rise just a little bit to 3% to just under $26 billion. In terms of what's happening at more of the industry levels, so for the beef and sheep meat industries, we're expecting the value of production to rise. And that broadly reflects higher prices as well as also higher production. So really we saw some good rainfall over the summer period across a lot of Australia, particularly along the east coast. And that combined with our assumption of average sort of rainfall and seasonal conditions is really expected to boost some of that demand, restocking demand in sale yards, which will place some upward pressure on prices. In the dairy industry, we're expecting a slightly different story. We have farm gate milk prices coming down. Just a little bit from their sort of really high levels we've seen over recent years, and combined with that, we're having production coming down just a little bit as well. So what we're seeing in the farm gate milk price side is we've got relatively low export prices for dairy products, and that is just expected to reduce the prices that processors are able to offer producers. If we look to the wool industry, we're expecting the value of wool production to rise. That's broadly due to prices rising by more than production is falling. And what we're seeing there is mainly around the global economic outlook story. So we're seeing global economic growth to be relatively stronger next year compared to 2023-24. That's going to boost some discretionary spending for woolen products. So wool is obviously quite a relatively niche and luxury product. So better discretionary spending is going to boost global demand for wool products as well as wool prices. So I guess the last one we'll finish up with is pigs and poultry. So value of pigs and poultry production is expected to rise mainly due to higher production more than outweighing a small decrease in prices. And that change broadly reflects prices for feed grains coming down just a little bit, as we'll see prices for a lot of those grains coming off a little bit in 24, 25. So broadly, it's a pretty good picture for the livestock sector going forward into 2024, 25. So as always, the thing to keep an eye on is how seasonal conditions develop, especially compared to how we have them assumed. So yeah, it's something to keep an eye on going forwards.
Excellent. Thanks, Alistair. So there's a lot going on in livestock, and it seems that, as you mentioned, an overall positive picture. But you mentioned also seasonal conditions being kind of a key driver of where we might end up. But we know that seasonal conditions particularly play a strong role in our cropping sector. And joined also with Emily Dow, who's our head of our cropping team here at ABARES. And so a question to you, Emily, picking up on the seasonal conditions, what are we expecting with cropping, especially as we see this kind of shift towards the more average, or potential there's maybe even upside? Where do we see those industries going?
Yeah, great. So much of Eastern Australia has recorded significant rainfall totals over summer. And this has boosted soil moisture levels across major cropping regions in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, as well as parts of South Australia. So good soil moisture bodes well for the upcoming winter cropping season, and area planted to winter crops is likely to increase for 24-25, especially in regions across Queensland and northern New South Wales, where last year we saw a pullback in area planted due to drier conditions. So an improvement year on year in seasonal conditions is likely to support average to above average yields in these eastern states. And as for Western Australia, hot and dry seasonal conditions have persisted over summer. However, an expected return to more neutral seasonal conditions should ensure that crop production reaches near average levels. So the total winter crop production in Australia for 24-25 is forecast to increase to around 51 million tonnes. And that's about 9% above that kind of historical 10-year average that we tend to compare our forecasts to. And that production forecast is also expected to drive an increase in the total value of Australian crop production. So the gross value of production for grains, oilseeds and pulses is forecast to increase in 24-25 to around $22.5 billion. And that is well above average. If realised, it could be the third highest value on record. And I'll just mention too that this is despite a forecast fall in prices. So world grain and oilseed prices are continuing to ease and returning to levels that were recorded prior to the international surge in prices back in 2022. So falling prices largely reflects an improvement in the world supply of grains and oilseeds. This is especially the case for corn and soybeans, as well as high volumes of Russian wheat exports. Now, even though prices are easing, a higher production forecast is expected to ensure that the total value of crop exports remains above average. And that's further supported by the return, or I suppose the reopening of the Chinese market for Australian barley. Now, I suppose going back to your question, Jared, around a potential onset of La Nina. So the forecast that I've mentioned, it depends heavily on how seasonal conditions play out over the year ahead. And some models are suggesting a potential La Nina developing this year. And I guess depending on timing, a shift to La Nina conditions could see winter crops in an excellent position come spring. And so that could drive or lift yield, production, as well as the value of production. So there's certainly a lot of upside potential.
Excellent. Thanks, Emily. Yeah, so that's really interesting about where we're going. And this chart always amazes me every time I see it, and every time Emily shows me that this big step up that we saw and just how exceptional it has been in recent years compared to our historical average, and how, despite some of the pressures that the sector is facing in this current year and looking ahead, how well it's actually doing. So thank you for that. I mean, this all comes down then, I guess, when we're thinking about these positive shifts in terms of our broadacre industries. And I recall this time last year we were talking about shifts going the other way, and I guess we were a little bit more down on where the fortunes were going. But how are we expecting this to go through to farm incomes from the historic highs? And to help answer that question, we've got Patrick Malco here, who's from our farm performance area, who can kind of go under, take what we've taken at the national level and the different states, and have a look at what that means for farm incomes. So, Patrick, if you could just give us a bit of a read as to how you think this is going to play out for farm performance.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. As Emily and Alistair have outlined, there's quite a lot going on in the cropping and livestock markets at the moment. And the broadacre farm incomes that I look at are really focused on the dryland cropping and sheep and beef farms. So these insights that you've outlined are really driving the forecast that I'm seeing up here on the graph. But yeah, as you can see in the graph, after 3 record income years, with strong prices and production, income took a significant dip this year. Next year, however, under average climate conditions, we're expecting an uptick in incomes, although still coming in under long-term averages. Incomes are expected to vary significantly across industries though. As Emily highlighted earlier, there's an expectation for cropping yield and production to increase this year. Forecast increased winter growing season rainfall are really driving that uptick in yields, and the increased production are expected to outpace the easing prices that were mentioned. While major cropping inputs like fertiliser, chemicals and fuel are expected to decrease in price next year, they are still expected to remain elevated, and given increased production, application rates are probably also going to increase, seeing the actual costs increase slightly year on year. But not by nearly as much as our revenue is expected to increase. So seeing cropping incomes come in slightly above 10-year averages. On the livestock side of things, herds have been well restocked after good conditions the last few years. Strong beef herd numbers are seeing quantity sold numbers remain high. Cattle price increases, Alistair mentioned, coupled with strong sale yard numbers, are seeing expected incomes for beef farmers to bounce back significantly this year after the decline seen this year. And like cropping farms, beef farm incomes are expected to be around the 10-year average. It's a similar story for the sheep farms. Herd size and sale numbers and improved prices are seeing incomes rise slightly. Having said this though, sheep, lamb and wool prices are expected to remain low in real terms, historically compared to historical numbers. And with costs remaining high, incomes for sheep farmers are expected to remain low in 24-25. While income provides a good indication of how farms are performing for the year, it doesn't quite capture the whole picture. Farm business profit helps sort of complete that picture by including changes in trading stocks, depreciation and a calculated value for manager/family labour. The difference becomes particularly apparent in dry years like 2018, 19 and 20, where farms were able to destock and keep destock their cattle and sheep to keep their cash flows high, but when you consider the value of training stocks, their profits were quite low, and so the gap really opened up there. Given improved conditions the last few years, that gap's narrowed as herd sizes have been rebuilt and increased grain production has really driven improved profit numbers. Despite this, profits are still forecast to come a bit under the 10-year average for this year. And like Emily was mentioning, the farm profit forecasts for this year are going to be highly dependent on weather and price forecasts. The effect of uncertainty in our weather forecast is captured by the grey lines on these graphs. And while average farm cash incomes and profits are expected to be a bit under the 10-year average, given mean climate conditions, upper estimates could see them coming in well above our 10-year average, or if drier conditions are realised, declines, we could see further declines in 24-25. But yeah, as I mentioned earlier, generally input prices are expected to ease in 24-25. Fuel, fertiliser and chemical prices are forecast to come down, given improved global supply and lower energy costs, although conflicts in the Middle East and Europe add considerable uncertainty to these forecasts and could impact supply chains. Despite cooling prices, increased production levels are expected to see overall costs increase. And while cooling, these prices still remain quite elevated, which is keeping pressure on our farm incomes and profits. But yeah, as a whole, Jared, expect an uptick in incomes and profits this year, which will be good considering the declines expected this year.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, so it is a bit of a positive story, although, as you highlight, quite a bit of risk in the sector at the moment in terms of where we look to for farm performance next year. And it was interesting you touched on costs, and we spoke a little bit about costs this morning. And we've heard a lot from, about costs across different industries and the pressures that are being faced. But I think one of the most, vocal around that has been our horticulture sector. And so I'd like to flick to that. And I've got Tim Kane here, who heads up our ag and forecasting program here at ABARES. And Tim, I'm going to put you on the spot here and get you to talk about horticulture. But given some of those pressures that Patrick mentioned and the like, how do you see that play out for the outlook for both horticulture and wine grapes?
Yeah. Thank you, Jared. And as you were talking about at this morning's session, horticulture is particularly affected by some of these input cost rises that we've been seeing. So over the past few years, we've seen a pretty sharp rise in the cost of fertiliser and chemicals, as well as freight and fuel. So in terms of fertiliser and chemicals, we've seen them come off pretty historic highs in 21-2 and 22-3. So they're sort of sitting more at a bit of a long-term average now and probably continue to ease through 24-25, as Patrick mentioned. The sort of freight and fuel costs are obviously still sitting a bit higher. They have come down from their peaks, and I think, as Lucy was saying in this morning's session, there is some still significant issues around particularly freight, and when we look at some of the conflict in the Middle East and Europe, that's obviously driving a little bit of the uncertainty and cost pressures there. So the other thing that horticulture sector generally has a significant problem is the cost of labour and the availability of labour, and that's obviously been exacerbated quite significantly since the COVID pandemic. We have seen the highest net migration in 22-23 on record, but that should start to alleviate some of those pressures. They do tend to persist, though, as finding sort of particularly seasonal labour is challenging in some of those areas. So we would expect that would probably ease a little bit into 24-25, continuing from some of that higher migration at least. Water is another very significant thing, and for many horticultural industries and enterprises, it's the biggest consideration in terms of the input costs. Obviously, when there's a lot of water and availability is high, the cost is low. We've had exceptional rainfall over many years now, so we have very, very high water availability, which means that the cost is generally pretty low. So going forward into 24-25, we think that will maintain pretty low levels. Low levels of cost, not levels of water reserve, I might add. But this would, mean that we probably won't expect to see too many horticultural industries have to start rationalising some of their production for 24-25. Again, a lot has been said about what happens if the climate changes and drier weather coming through and all these sorts of things, and that is definitely a consideration in the medium term. And if the cost of water were to go up, that might start driving some of those changes and some of that rationalisation that might need to happen in terms of decision making for the sector. But looking to what we sort of think production is doing, 24-25 looks pretty good for horticulture, where we're forecasting it to rise by 3% to a record $17.8 billion in value, which is an excellent outcome, and that's really on the back of a very strong export market, particularly for some of the high value commodities like almonds and citrus. And as the Secretary was saying a little bit earlier, this is largely driven by things like free trade agreements with India and sort of boosting some of those sales for almonds and citrus. So we think that the horticulture sector looks in a pretty strong position going into 24-25, notwithstanding some of those cost pressures that are coming through. Unfortunately, it's not as rosy a picture for the wine sector. Over probably the last nearly 2 decades, global consumption of wine has dropped off quite dramatically. So we're seeing that kind of play through in terms of very dampened demand. Domestically, that means that we have seen the price for a lot of the grapes dropping, and in particular exacerbated by an excess of supply in particularly warm inland regions for white varietals. So, red varietals. So what we're seeing there is that there's downward pressure on the prices, and in 24-25 we'll think that those prices will continue to ease off even further. We're sort of forecasting 3% nationally. Obviously that's going to be very different across different regions of the country, but largely driven by those warm inland regions. We're also seeing the value of production come back 2% in 24-25, basically reflecting those lower prices and that really softening demand globally. Then going back to the kind of water question and the question about the input costs, if they continue to drive some of those, we would expect some of those changes to filter through in the wine sector in the medium term, in particular as growers start thinking about either needing to exit the industry or switch to other sort of more profitable endeavours like almonds or citrus or those sorts of things. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of how those costs will actually flow through the sectors, but broadly speaking, I think that sort of captures what our thinking is for the coming year.
Excellent, thank you, Tim, and thanks to everyone. Yeah, so there's a growth, but a very interesting dynamic going underneath for the horticulture sector. And so just while we get the questions up, so I can start to engage with them a little bit more, I might just jump in and ask Alistair a question. I was going to ask him, there's a question there about why cheese is so expensive, but he might be able to touch on that as well. But maybe just also to expand outside of cheese, how do you think some of the dynamics that are playing out in the US, particularly with their beef herd and rebuilding and so forth, how's that playing out to international markets? And then I'll get you to give us a response to cheese.
On to cheese, happy to do that. So I guess starting off with sort of what we're seeing in the US is particularly prominent for the beef herd that we're seeing. So we've seen the US cattle herd have quite a long and prolonged destocking period over the last couple of years, and what that's really led is their beef cow inventory is down around 1960s levels, so it's the lowest it's been for a very, very long time. And so what that's meaning is we've started to see their production decline, mainly because their cattle herd's getting so small, and that's really providing a really good opportunity for Australian beef exports, because the US is really a large importer of beef products, and particularly from Australia. So we've seen the US market become a really strong choice for Australian beef exporters, and so that's really becoming sort of a good picture story to help at a time when Australian beef export volumes are at a really high level. So it's good that Australian beef exporters are having a great market to send their extra product into in the US. On the sheep side as well, the US is also had produced good demand for sheep meat exports as well. So it's another good picture there, particularly on the lamb side. So that's the red meat US aspect of it. Why is cheese so expensive? So cheese, I'll take it on the domestic side firstly. I guess obviously we've seen record high farm gate milk prices in nominal terms over the last couple of years, and obviously that flows through as a high input cost into the dairy processors and eventually flows through to your supermarket shelves. And we have seen cheese inflate in the CPI really quite significantly over the last couple of quarters, but it has slowed down in more recent publications we've had. So on the domestic side, we've seen that cheese price holding really high because that aspect. On the export price story of cheese, it's a sort of an interesting story. We've seen a really big divergence between Australian cheese export prices and more of the world cheese export prices, and that's really been driven by really strong demand for cheese from Japan. And so Australian cheese is really a preferred location of cheese that's used as an ingredient in processing in Japan. So that demand was really what drove quite a high cheese price, and that high export price of Australian cheese also helped then flow back into holding its high domestic price as well.
Excellent, thanks Alistair. I might turn to Patrick. There's some questions about, I guess, the debt and equity held by farmers, which you might have a view on. If not, I'll be able to jump in for you. But maybe on interest costs as well as part of that as we go across the farm sector. Is that playing a role in some of the farm performance outcomes as we see?
I mean, it certainly is. in the report we've got a bit more of a breakdown on our income, our cost and receipts items, and you can certainly see that our interest costs are certainly starting to take up a larger and larger portion of our total costs as the interest rates have certainly increased the last few years. I think, as there was talk of in the earlier session, we are expecting those interest rates to come off slightly in the issue next year, which will help alleviate some of those pressures. It is a little bit tricky with the model and how we do that because we can't explicitly model all of our variables, and so we don't model debt and hold that fixed from our last survey year, and so some of our figures around debt and equity aren't quite as up to date as some of our production and income forecasts. But no, it is certainly something that's starting to creep into our projections as a much larger cost item with our interest rate increases and sort of the trend towards larger land packages and purchasing land to sort of increase enterprise sizes. And there's certainly a lot more debt coming on as well.
Oh, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, and it's one of the things that we've found through a number of our surveys with debt and equity is that there's a significant amount of farms that don't hold much debt, have very high equity levels, and then we get a fairly high concentration of the debt amongst the smaller group of farms, particularly those some of that are in the growth space, but we see a bit of a difference. And for those who are fairly heavily leveraged, obviously the rising interest rate costs are starting to play a role into where they go. But it's certainly not a universal picture across the sector in terms of where we see debt and equity and farm performance occurring. There is a question that I want to ask as well in terms of where we're going for wine grapes. And there's a question that came up about China potentially not being silver bullet, and maybe what do we think about some of the longer or the medium term plantings for the sector and where that might play out for the wine grape sector?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I think that's probably the first thing to remember is that it's not the silver bullet. It was a significant loss at the time that we obviously saw some of those tariffs come in, but subsequently the consumption of wine in China has sort of halved or more than halved. So it's sort of gone down 55% between 2017 and 2022. So it's sort of on a downward trend to begin with. You're also seeing a number of these other countries that are competing with us, like Chile on price, and Italy in terms of the volume that they're able to provide. So China has pivoted towards them in terms of a lot of the imports. Having said all of that, it will be certainly a welcome reprieve, I think, for the wine sector, and it will certainly help to clear some of the backlogs that we're seeing. But I don't think by any means it will be the sort of volume that we were seeing prior to sort of 2020. But it will, as I say, welcome reprieve and probably potentially help support some of those wine grape growers. But again, I think the broader issue is more of that structural change that needs to happen. And you've currently got falling demand across the world. You've got falling demand domestically. We've got high sort of already established bearing areas for grapes. So there will still be those pressures that exist, and I still expect over the sort of medium term that you would still start to see some of those bearing areas come down as the industry needs to rationalise. And even looking internationally, last year it was estimated that Chile pulled out about 13% of their productive capacity in terms of their vines. So there is that structural change that's going on globally, and so I think that market forces will start to really prevail again. But at the moment it's just a pretty low point, and as I think you say, Jared, it'll be a welcomed relief.
Thanks, Tim. Maybe just finally turning to you, Emily. There's a request for maybe a bit more detail on the individual components of our GVP forecast, but some of the dynamics that we're seeing in terms of, I guess, overall production globally across our suite, both the coarse grains, the grains and oilseeds. Do you want to just unpack a little bit some of the main drivers that might influence international markets as well?
Yeah, so I suppose one of the big factors there is improved seasonal conditions for some major exporting and producing countries. So that's something we've seen with, for instance, corn production and soybean production in both Argentina and the United States. As well with wheat, and so what's playing out with wheat markets is, as I mentioned earlier, high volumes of Russian wheat exports, and that's following 2 consecutive high production years, as well as another large wheat harvest expected for 24-25. So I suppose, to answer the questions around GVP, the value that I mentioned earlier was that the total value of production for grains, oilseeds and pulses is forecast to increase to $22.5 billion. And so driving that increase is a 2% increase in the value of wheat production, a 7% increase in the value of canola production, and about a 5% increase in the value of barley production. And on prices as well, I suppose some of the easing in prices also reflects the reduced uncertainty surrounding trade flows from the Black Sea. And this is especially given the expansion in export capacity in Ukraine.
Thanks, Emily. Now we're just pretty much out of time, and so I don't hold you up too much before lunch. I just want to hold you up for just one second. And so something that the Minister mentioned this morning, and as we drive forward to try and improve both, I guess, the data that we provide here in ABARES, but also the agriculture statistics that we all rely on and to use to make decisions. And I'd like to highlight there's a partnership that we've established between us here in ABARES and the ABS, and we've got Rob Walters here from the ABS, who, we're looking to modernise the agriculture statistics that are currently produced. The key platform in that project really is about the use of existing public and private data so that we can really produce statistics more timely at a better regional scale and to improve accuracy, but importantly also to reduce the respondent burden that exists across every one of us. And so just to announce that in May, the ABS is going to publish publishes agriculture statistics. You should be able to say the word agriculture, right? We'll publish agriculture statistics for the 22-23 financial year. And this is a milestone because it's going to be the first set of statistics that we're going to publish without running an agricultural census or a major commodity survey, both of which have been stopped by the ABS. And so we'll have improved regional detail, but it's a first step on a longer journey. But it does mean that there's a number of steps that we need to take to complete the full suite of statistics. And so we're interested in working with all of you and would encourage all of you to reach out to both us and the ABS to get involved and to help us fill these gaps in a timely way and to reduce that respondent burden. So just put that plug in, and I know the Minister mentioned that this morning as well. And so with that, if you could all join with me in thanking our great panel for their insights. And we can have a break for lunch, and we'll see you back here after the break. So thank you very much.